So I want to raise this question, which in a way has already been answered. That does it make sense to insert a $15 minimum wage into a stimulus package? And there are two paths to follow with regard to search for the answer. You can go to the left based on belief in both the efficacy of minimum wages and fiscal stimulus, or you can go to the right, expressing doubt and fear about both of those items. I have two, I'm going to talk about two related topics. One is the fiscal stimulus that's intended to cure demand constrained markets, and the minimum wage, which creates demand constrained labor markets. And I suggest that there might be a conflict between those two policies. So there are two models of the minimum wage effect. One is the Republican competitive market model. And this has job loss a sure thing when you raise the price above the market price. There's a safety valve which allows restaurants in particular to pass price increases onto their customers and maybe not have much in the way of employment loss. The least productive workers are the ones who are most at risk of the minimum wage. And the right solution is to reduce the number of low-skilled workers through education and training, increase the demand for them with wisely crafted regulations. And an alternative to income maintenance would be the earned income tax credit. The Democratic model is a one buyer model, sometimes called a company town, where workers have to do bilateral bargains with a single employer, and that works greatly to their disadvantage. And the implication is that a minimum wage can increase both wages and employment by giving more market power to the workers. And a union can provide an equivalent kind of balancing of market power. And these are kind of the two extreme views. The reality is a mixture of the two. But the most important thing is we need clear evidence. Republicans and Democrats surely agree that there's a wage too high. 50 is too high. But is 15 too high? That's the issue. And the New York Times, has, like a lot of media, will publish things that are in favor of the minimum wage and those that are against. On the left side of the screen, you have this woman warning that she's going to cut employment in Fresno at her restaurant if minimum wages are increased. On the right, the same newspaper on the same day publishes this story about how the academic literature has not been able to find much support for employment consequences of minimum wage increases. So this slide shows you that states have their own minimum wages. The dark line represents the federal minimum. The thinner lines represent individual states. Not all states have minimum wages in place, and many of them are superseded by the federal minimum wage. So back there in the 80s, that dark line was sitting on top of most of the states. The states' minimum wages were not operative. But over here on the right, there's a lot of variability across states of minimum wages above the federal level. And I pose this question, isn't it wise to have geographic variability in minimum wages as the economies vary from state to state or from county to county, as we're going to get to here in a minute? So this shows you the target of the $15 minimum wage. This is the green states that currently have the federal minimum wage. The reds already have their own minimum wages above 12, so they're not much affected. The green is sort of the Republican states, and the reds are the Democratic states. So in a way, Democrats are trying to pose their view on the Republican states. We're going to look at the impact of California minimum wage as a way of understanding what's happening at the national level, what will happen at the national level. And this is the national minimum wage, not corrected for price level, but it's now at $7.25, and it's been that since 2010. This is the California minimum wage, which takes off in 2014 and goes to $15 an hour in 2022. This is the Democratic proposal, which I suggest runs kind of parallel to what California has done. So maybe there's news, information in the California data about what might be faced at the federal level. And here's another chart that's a little complicated, but it makes the point that California is a useful experiment. This is a reference to 6-digit NAICS employment and wages. The horizontal axis is the average weekly wages of these 6-digit sectors. The vertical represents the cumulative earnings, cumulative employment across these sectors. And you see down here in the bottom, and red's the California, blue's the national cumulative, up to about 30%. The nation and California are very similar. In other words, there's a lot of low-wage workers in California, just as there are in the U.S. overall. California is different at the high end, where minimum wages don't matter. But the lower end is my point, that if we look at what's happened to California, maybe we'll find something about the U.S. So in looking at California, we're going to focus on particularly the restaurant sectors. The lowest wage sector, this is the 6-digit data, the lowest wage sector is these home healthcare sectors that have an average weekly wage of only $314. But the odd thing about that sector, relevant to what the conversation is today, is that this sector has about the same number of establishments as it does employment, suggesting these people are kind of operating as individual self-employed people and maybe not much affected by the minimum wage. So let's instead move down to limited service restaurants, which has 500,000 workers in California and a low average weekly wage of $30.96. And down at the bottom is the full service restaurants with a large number of employees, but a much higher wage paid, and therefore less likely to be impacted by the federal minimum wage. So let's focus on these limited service, full service restaurants. That's an image of at a county level, wages paid in limited service restaurants, and the red is less than $12. So those are the ones that would be those would be the counties where minimum wages would have a big impact on limited service restaurants. This is the same image for full service, where the red isn't so clear. You can see California over here, which has some green, which is bigger than 18. Those look like tourist destinations. And the yellow, which is between 15 and 18, might be impacted somewhat by the 15 minimum wage, but not that much. Hardly any red at all there in California. But clearly, the full service restaurants are not going to be impacted as much as limited service restaurants. So let's take a look at this image while I make sure I'm on time here. This image has California counties comparing what they were like in 2006 to what they were like in 2019 after the minimum wage went up from $9.25 up to $12. So each red dot represents a county. The horizontal axis is the 2006 average wage in limited service restaurants, and the vertical is the percent growth in wages. And the orange dots are summarized by that orange curve, which says that the counties that started with low wages in limited service restaurants tended to have larger increases. And to give a sense of the increase in the minimum wage that occurred, this blue line represents the mandated increase when you go from 675 up to 12. If you start at 12, there's no impact. But as you start at lower numbers, it gets less and less. It gets higher and higher impact, and that kind of pushes the curve up at the lower end, and you can see it definitely did. So I would say we have pretty clear evidence that the minimum wage is having an impact on average weekly wages. What about employment? Well, it's definitely the case that the lower wage counties in 2006 had less employment growth in restaurants from 2006 to 2019, suggesting that there was an employment effect. What about full service? Full service also shows some impact of minimum wage, meaning that the lowest wage counties have the highest growth rate. And there's also a suggestion that there's an employment effect. But this doesn't control for anything else that's going on inside the county. Like there's some counties that have had large increases in overall wages and some that have had big increases in employment. Those should be reasons why restaurant wages would be growing and employment would be growing. So let's look at the two ratio variables, which are restaurant wages divided by overall wages and restaurant employment divided by overall employment. So now we're going to look at the same kind of image. So now the horizontal axis is the same, which is 2006 average weekly wage. The vertical axis is now percent growth in the ratio. So we're still finding that controlling for the growth in overall wages in a county, the lower wage counties had larger increases in wages. And similarly, it looks like there's an employment effect for the limited service restaurants when you control for employment growth overall. Here we have the growth of the ratio or the employment share in limited service restaurants on the right-hand side. And what about full service? Maybe a little hint about wages, maybe not so much really, and definitely not an employment effect once you control for overall growth in the county. So here's my summary of this, which is, I think as usual in these minimum wage studies, there's a clear impact of the minimum wage on wages. But there's not such a clear impact on employment. But I would say the data are suggestive that there's a reduction of employment in limited service restaurants and maybe a suggestion of a shift from limited service restaurants to full service restaurants, because the full service restaurants are suggestive, the data are suggesting there's actually an improvement in the employment. So then I pose this hypothetical question: wouldn't it be wiser to let the minimum wage vary by local conditions? Here it's, in this image, it's tied to local average, county average weekly wages per the QCEW survey. And this is organized so that overall the minimum wage is 15 on average, but it varies from county to county. So there's some green counties with a minimum wage of over 16 and some red counties that's still at 7.25 because they are very low wage counties. So now let's shift to the other topic, related topic, which is the COVID-19 stimulus or whatever it is. So here's the typical supply and demand model with demand curve sloping downward and supply curve sloping up and a market equilibrium. Now we suppose that because of recession problem, demand is shifted downward for the economy overall, and that would produce a new market equilibrium, which is lower prices and lower volume. But if prices don't adjust very rapidly, you're going to get a demand constrained equilibrium. And the cure for that demand constrained equilibrium is a fiscal stimulus that increases demand. The minimum wage, though, itself creates demand constrained equilibria, and that's going to make it harder for the fiscal stimulus actually to work. So my view is we shouldn't be increasing minimum wages during recessions because of the impact on the demand constrained equilibria. And I note that the California minimum wage law allows the governor to postpone it during recession, but Governor Newsom opted not to do that. So what about supply constrained equilibrium? Here's demand supply curve, but suppose that COVID-19 shuts down a part of the economy. That would require a new market equilibrium with higher prices and lower volume. But if prices don't move much, then you get a supply constrained equilibrium depicted here. So in that case, the stimulated demand can't change the supply constraint. And Jerry and Leo worry that there's also a demand reduction from COVID-19, which is legitimate, but it could still leave a supply constraint rather than a demand constraint as the main operative force in the economy. So what's a fiscal stimulus? Is it a tax cut or a spending increase financed by borrowing? What have been the numbers so far? In 2009, the Obama stimulus was only $831 billion. We had a March 2020 CARES Act, which is 2.2 trillion, a June 2020, which is another 3 trillion, and now another 1.9 trillion. That seems like a heck of a lot, especially compared with what Obama did. So how much does this matter? This image on the left-hand side is the actual federal deficit. This is the boxes during the Obama era. This is at an annualized rate. So the Obama stimulus rate increased the federal deficit by about $1 trillion on an annualized rate. What about what we've had now? It's more like 5 trillion. It's just astounding. So let's go over here to look at the gap between GDP and trend GDP and compare that with the federal stimulus as measured by the federal deficit. So this first column is the GDP shortfall compared to trend. So, and over here on the right is the federal deficit. The first column is the actual federal deficit, which is just taken from the numbers on the left, on the image on the left. And then this is compared with Q1, the change since Q1. That's the new policy in place that increased the deficit. So we can see that the GDP shortfall was around 2 trillion, but the stimulative effect of those fiscal policies is 4 trillion. It's way more than simply offsetting the weakness in GDP. And of course, as Leo has mentioned, a large fraction of that 4 trillion at an annualized rate has gone into savings. But to me, that's a big monster lurking in our financial system. When it jumps out, there's a risk that we're going to have some serious inflation. And so conclusions, the efficacy of the minimum wage depends on when and where it is imposed. A minimum wage creates a demand-constrained equilibrium that is likely to exacerbate a recession. A common minimum wage across all counties is likely to have minimal effect on the highest wage counties and disastrous effects on the low wage counties. We need geographic variability. There's an important difference between a program designed to maintain incomes and a program that's intended to stimulus. The stimulus comes later, not now. And then keep in mind, there are two things that can get too big: a minimum wage and a stimulus. And with that, I join you, I hope, and say goodbye to 2020 and hope we're going to have a great year ahead. Thank you very much.